Okay, so welcome everyone. Shiver, I organize the series, which is why I introduce each one of the sessions. So welcome to the Undergraduate Research Education Series. If you have never attended via Zoom or in person or watched a recording, welcome for the very first time. If you have done any of those things, welcome back to the series. I want to start, the very first thing I want to do is start us off with a land acknowledgement. So the American Indian Resource Center at the University of Utah's campus and Ella Blanchard lead the way for me to acknowledge. I sort of took my land acknowledgement from them and modified it a little bit. So they lead the way for me to acknowledge that the land that the University of Utah resides on has always been on Indigenous lands, specifically the lands of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. It's also imperative that we acknowledge the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. Through this land acknowledgement, I want to express my personal gratitude and appreciation for their persevering to protect the land for future generations. The erasure of this relationship between Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands is an insidious form of ongoing colonization, and we need to build our mindfulness of this and other Indigenous protocols. And of course, the best way to respect Indigenous peoples would be to give the land back. With that, some more education series, kind of specific housekeeping stuff. For those of you, the 83 of you who have logged in, you don't have to fill out an evaluation form. There's nothing else that you need to do for this to count for an attendance. We've got your login information already recorded. For those of you who are watching the pre-recorded version of this that will be posted on the education series page, please do go to the top of that page and fill out the evaluation form that's linked there. That will count as your attendance via the pre-recorded video. I will also drop that link in the chat for everyone who's attending in person, attending the live Zoom event right now. We appreciate your feedback, but if you, again, are in this meeting right now live, you're not at all required to do that. Okay, so today we are learning about responsible conduct of research from Dr. James Tabery, who has a primary appointment in the Department of Philosophy here at the University of Utah, and also has a couple of other appointments in pediatrics and internal medicine. So knows a lot of kind of varied stuff, and take it away.
Thanks, Trevor. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for setting us off. I'm thrilled to see such a large group of students here. We're going to talk about a topic that I think is fascinating and important. This is going to be a very interactive conversation. Much of it is going to be driven by cases that I present you, cases that actual scientists from the past encountered, and then we're going to work through them together. And so what I just ask you is to be engaged, be attentive, be a part of the conversation, share your perspective. The more disciplinary perspectives we have here, the better. The more personal experiences, perhaps some of these are situations that you've encountered yourself that you can draw on to add to the conversation, the better. I think all of that will be really, really useful. And so I'm looking forward to learning from you. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Can you all see that? Great, thanks. Okay, so there's two sort of ways to think about what we're going to be talking about today. One way is to consider it the responsible conduct of research. RCR is the acronym that you may have encountered or you may encounter in the near future to sort of capture this whole range of issues. Shiver, are you going to monitor? Are you able to monitor chat as it comes in and then just yell at me if I'm missing something that's I can draw on?
That Thanks. Comment was the link to the evaluation.
Okay, terrific. Okay, good. So, one way to think about this is responsible conduct of research. Another way to think of it is it's research ethics. It's ethical issues that arise in the context of conducting research. And so here are the kind of objectives that I want to cover with you over the next 50 minutes or so. I want to give you a sense of just what are the various issues that are recognized as falling under this RCR or research ethics umbrella. And then the way we want to start engaging is looking at some famous cases from the history of science, where in retrospect, we can see the scientists behaved responsibly, or in other cases, irresponsibly. A lot of times when you're doing ethics, seeing people behave badly is actually in certain cases more instructive than seeing them behave well, because you can sort of see where the errors occurred. But then what we also want to do is sort of imagine in each scenario that we had a kind of time machine, and we could take that scenario from the past and move it to the present and ask ourselves, how would the current regulatory system that we all play by in contemporary academic research handle the kind of situation that we saw in the past? And then that will also then give you a sort of a taste for what that current regulatory system is. Okay, so this is sort of, this slide answers that first objective, which is just to tell you these are basically the topics that fall under the umbrella of RCR. What we're talking about here are data management issues, how to navigate conflicts of interest. By and large, what that literature has historically revolved around are financial conflicts of interest, but we also might be thinking about institutional conflicts of interest, personal conflicts of interest, intellectual conflicts of interest, research involving humans, research involving non-human animals, research misconduct. That's sort of the worst of the worst. And we'll talk about what that actually, what might fall into the research misconduct category. Issues of publishing and authorship, right? That's sort of like, what does it take to be listed as an author on a paper? What are the disciplinary differences in how authorship is assessed? How do you decide whether somebody's at the beginning of a paper or at the back of the paper, or second or third or seventh? The mentor-trainee relationship. So what's the relationship between the PI, that might be somebody that you're working with, or it's a faculty member that you're working with. Peer review, evaluating other people's work, and then collaborative science, team science. Okay, so that's what we're going to be looking at. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a sample of 4 cases from the history of science that will each draw on one or more facets of what we think of as the responsible conduct of research. Any questions before we start diving in here? Any comments, any sort of general inspirational thoughts? Okay, well then let's jump in. So this is the first case. It's definitely a data management case. And then I could have put a question mark after the research misconduct. There's sort of an ongoing debate about whether or not this would constitute research misconduct. So here's how all these cases are gonna, the structure they'll take. I'll present you with this scenario, and then I just want you to kind of think about how you would go about doing this. And if you want, you can type your answer into the chat and sort of that you can weigh in that way. If you're at all able to monitor that, Shiver, just at the level of like trends, that would be helpful. If you want to jump in and say something that works as well. So now I got to figure out how to move this bar out of the way. Good. Okay, so you've developed a new methodology to determine the charge of an important subatomic structure. When you look at all the data that you've collected, it looks like most of the data are all pointing to a similar charge, but there's variation. And you're convinced that the variation is the result of some issues that you were still working out as you were creating this new methodology. So you've got about 140 data points total, but you think that about 80 of them are methodologically contaminated. They didn't produce the way they should have produced because there was something that was still being worked out. So now the question is, when you're going to publish your results, right? What do you publish? How do you convey the data? Do you publish all 140, statistically analyze all 140? Do you publish all 140, but then analyze both the 140 and just the 60 that you think are more reliably processed? Do you publish all 140, but only statistically analyze the 60 that you think are legitimate? Or do you just publish the 60 that you think are legitimate and then obviously just statistically analyze the 60 that you think are legitimate? So go ahead and jump into chat and just plug in a 1, 2, 3, or 4. If you were this scientist, how would you go about doing it? Look at all these numbers coming in. That's awesome. So Shiver, do we see any trends? Is it completely random?
I think we're seeing a lot of 2s.
Okay, a lot to choose.
A couple of other answers, some threes. I think I saw 4 up sort of at the beginning, a 1,
Okay.
but mostly 2s.
Okay, so let me hear from somebody who picked 2. Share your reasoning on why that made sense. And go ahead and just unmute yourself and jump in.
I'll mention something.
Yeah, please go ahead, Kenyon.
For me, I think a really important aspect of presenting data is transparency, and so I chose 2 because you're not trying to hide anything. You are presenting all of the data that you collected, but then you can also advocate for a point that you say, as it says, with an explanation, where you think, well, I think these 60 points are more relevant for one reason or another, and kind of leave it up to the person, reading the publication, or who's interpreting it, how they want to analyze that. But as long as you're being transparent, you're not, you're staying in your place as a researcher instead of going beyond that.
Great, thanks, Kenyon. So we've got both a kind of appeal to a principle of transparency, which I think is always a wise thing to keep in mind, but then also this sense of, yeah, but you do really think there's something different between the 140 and the 60, and so you've still created an opportunity for yourself to kind of convey that in some way. Dallin, I see your hand went up.
Yeah, so I think especially with this being a novel methodology, right, that's super important to talk about, right? If this is going to be something new to the field, it's extremely important that everyone's able to see kind of what you went through, even if there's some outliers that you think might be due to some working issues still, right? So let's say another lab goes and does it, and then they run into the same issues, and you haven't published those other data points. They're going to think that they've done it wrong, whatever, right? And so I think especially with a novel methodology, it's really, really important to publish everything and just to kind of get everything out on the table. Like Kenyon was saying, right, with transparency and all that. But that kind of helps just bolster the field when we're talking about everything we're going through, both the good and the bad.
That's a great point, Dallin. I'm glad you brought it up, because you're right. You're sort of reinforcing Kenyon's point about transparency, but drawing attention to a different reason for it. It's not just because it's the right thing to do, or you want to sort of be honest. But you're right, there's this sort of sense of, if we think of science as a collaborative enterprise where everybody is collectively engaged in this, effort to understand the nature of fill in the blank, right? Whether it's a molecule or physical reality, then if you've developed a new way that you think gives you access to that information, and you are not transparent in terms of how it actually works or what challenges that are created along the way, then you do a disservice to that exercise, because the people who are going to try to replicate what you've done, right, are in some sense operating in the dark. Thanks for bringing that up. Anybody who picked 3? I'm sort of, just to kind of, Shiver said that there were also some 3s out there, and I'd just be curious to hear what the thought would have been on 3 as opposed to 2, because I think probably if you wound up in the middle here, you could have easily gone to 2 if you were a 3, or 3 if you were a 2.
I ended up picking 2, but I was kind of vacillating between 2 and 3.
Okay, talk about that.
And I think for me, it was at the end of the train of thought. My conclusion with 2 was that if you analyze both 140 and the 60, you think you know what's going on, and you think the problem is methodological, but it might not be. And with 3, if it was, I know that this is going to be something that I can solve in the near future, so I'm going to give you all of the data points because of transparency, but I'm only going to analyze 60. I think that's almost a manipulative paper in a way.
Okay.
But I do understand, because you are still having that transparency of having all of the data points, and you do still have the transparency of explaining why you're only analyzing 60. So I can see where that would be a choice, especially if it wasn't as novel of a method.
Good, Alex. Yeah. So, and it sounds like in part that's going to hinge on sort of how confident you are about the reasons for why any particular result fell into that 80 versus the 60, and whether or not we think sort of being confident is a good guide to making a decision like this. Does anybody know? So these are all classic cases from the history of science. Does anybody know what famous scientists found themselves in this situation?
This is Millikan, right?
Yes. Who said that?
Dave Kita.
Oh, that's cheating. Dean of grad school. Okay. Very good.
This
Dean
is Nobel
Kita. That's
Prize work. Actually, the question came up years after he received his Nobel Prize.
That's exactly right.
By a bitter rival.
It did. That's right. Yes. Okay. Wow. I thought an undergrad swooped in there and got that. But I'll tell you what, I've given this talk to a lot of people, and most faculty don't know this. So that's impressive, regardless of how long you've been in the game.
Just to be fair, a student did make that mention in the comments.
Oh, so can you say who it is?
Nathan Freed. I might have missed.
Wow. Well, bravo, Nathan. That's impressive. So that's right. This is the famous case of Robert Millikan. He did the majority of the work on this at the beginning of the 20th century, first decade of the 20th century at the University of Chicago. And as Dean Kita just mentioned, he won the Nobel Prize fairly shortly afterwards. Just a decade later, he gets the Nobel Prize for this work. And just to kind of explain how this works, because it's true, he does create this methodology to actually do the work. Let me save that just for a second. So it was used to determine the charge of an electron. So that was the subatomic particle that was being studied here. And what this work famously sort of proved was that A, electrons exist, and B, it put an actual charge on the electron, which is sort of remarkably similar to what we now even recognize as the charge on the electron. So it's seen even in retrospect as quite an achievement. And the way it worked here, can you all see my pointer when I'm moving it around on the screen? Okay, so good. So this is the oil drop experiment apparatus. A mist of oil would be sprayed in this chamber, and the goal was to get one drop to fall through this slit, and then by controlling the charge on these plates, hover in space there. And Millikan and his students working with him would, meanwhile, look through an optical device to control the charge on those plates and try to get that to happen. Then they do some fancy math and physics, which is way above my pay grade. And that's what ends up sort of generating the data that leads to the oil drop experiment, that leads to the publication that gets them the charge of an electron. And so when we're talking about, those data points, 140 versus 60 versus 80, basically each one of those is an episode where Millikan and the people working with him are trying to kind of do this exercise of getting a drop in there, staying in place, measuring the charges, and calculating from that. So here's where things get interesting or controversial. In the 1970s, I think it was, which as Dr. Kita mentioned, was decades after Millikan was even dead, a historian of science named Gerald Horton went back and looked at the research notebooks of Millikan through this period. And what he found was that during the period when Millikan is drawing his data, and he says in the publication itself, these are the data points I accumulated over this period of time, and it is not just a selection of data points. In fact, it was a selection of data points. Millikan, so of those 4 options that you had, Millikan went with 4. Okay, he reported 60 and he did the analysis on 60. And so the question was, did Millikan falsify his data? Did he essentially lie? Or was he in some sense controlling for the methodological problems that he was still working out as he was crafting this machine? Okay. To start unpacking this and have you think about it, these are the various explanations that Millikan gives for, in fact, I got here, maybe I'll pull this up because it's really cool to see. I'm going to share my screen again, but share something different. Can you guys see that? Can you see the, no? Oh, strange.
It popped up right after I shook my
Oh,
head.
it did? Okay, sorry, okay. So, let me show you. This is Millikan's notebook. It's located at Caltech. And the library, the archivist there scanned it. So you can actually see Millikan's entries for this. And basically each entry, each data point, each collection looks something like this. You've got him calculating the numbers that he's collecting during that period. And then he also inevitably jots something down somewhere that sort of takes stock of that particular experiment, right? So in this one, you can see he wrote down beauty, publish. See if I can find another good one. Beauty. Publish this surely, beautiful. Error high, will not use. Publish, looks like it says better here. Yeah, so you know, what I just want to give you a kind of taste of what the notebook looks like, what Horton saw that then led him to say, hey, wait a second, this isn't exactly what Millikan told us way back when, right? So what I'm giving you on this slide then, now you've got the context to appreciate what's going on here. What I'm giving you on this slide then is the various things that Millikan jotted down in his notebook for each case, right? And based on reading these, you should be able to tell pretty clearly, like, is this one that made it into that 60 that he reports, or is it one that makes it into the 80 that he doesn't report, right? So we can see things like possibly a double drop. This drop flickered. Looks like the volts are a little uncertain and temperature was also bad. Almost exactly right, best one I ever had. Publish this, surely, beautiful. Error high, won't use. Perfect, publish. Too high. All right, so now you're getting a taste of kind of the reasoning here. So now what I want to kind of ask you is, you could get more information, but just based on what you've seen here, you know, does it look like Millikan's decision to proceed with just reporting the 60? Does that seem like a responsible manipulation of the data? Does that seem like a responsible decision to have made with the data? I'm curious to hear from some students who we haven't heard from yet. Does anybody want to jump in and share a thought? It could be either way. You might think, yeah, now I see, you know, initially it didn't make sense to me, but now that I've seen his reasoning, I get it. Or, whoa, now that I've seen the reasons he's given, actually, this is a little concerning.
I had a thought.
Yeah,
if
please.
that's all right.
Please.
It's interesting because the wording he uses, as far as I can tell, is a little ambiguous because he says, oh, this is beautiful. And you don't know if that means the methodology, I did it correctly, or this is the result that I want, therefore publish this. And because he leaves it ambiguous, doesn't publish that data, now we're looking back and now we're questioning his character. And if he had just been forthright and published his process and exactly what he was thinking, we wouldn't be having this discussion.
Good, thanks. Is it Caton?
Caton,
thank you. Yeah, excellent. Any other thoughts?
There's a comment in the chat. I think his intentions were good with controlling of error. However, it was manipulative because it wasn't mentioned in the publication.
Okay, yeah. Here's another way I'll sort of phrase the question. So if we go back to those various reasons that we see, which ones might you think look more or less worrisome? Right. So if the explanation is Millikan was just controlling for experimental error, methodological issues he was working out, which of these look straightforward in that domain, and which looks like there's something else going on that isn't so easily, or at least with the limited information we have, obviously able to say this was a methodological issue.
So I think the one on January 26th, it says like possibly a double drop. So
Yeah.
I think that's a very clear methodological issue. But
Yeah,
then
exactly.
other
So
ones, yeah, but then other ones are like, publish this surely beautiful. So that makes it seem like, oh, this one's good, I'm only going to publish this.
Right, which sort of gets to Caton's point, right? Is it that awesome, the thing's working, or is it that's exactly what I was expecting, right? And if it's that's exactly what I was expecting, then we're a little bit worried about, you know, to what extent he's testing something versus sort of looking for evidence that confirms a suspicion, right? The other ones that might fall into that latter category, right, are the error high will not use and too high by 1.5%. Again, we don't have all the information there. It's just as jotting down, but one interpretation there was, it looks like he's saying, this is not what I was expecting. It's outside the range of what I was expecting. And then the question is it outside the range of what he was expecting because the methodology was failing in some way? Or is it outside the range of what he was expecting? And that's enough for him to decide that that's not going to cut it, right?
Did he have like a specific model or like theory that he developed beforehand and used the experiment to like justify it, or does
he
the
was in the
lead to the model or theory?
Great question, Henry. So he was in the midst. Dean Chieda actually alluded to this when he pointed out that it was Millikan. He was in the midst of a pretty heated dispute with another physicist based in Austria, I believe, about whether or not electrons existed at all. He was sort of, and so the question was both, do they exist? And if they do, what's the charge? And so this work that we're looking at here is what builds up to and then leads to the publication that people point to and saying, this is the paper that shows they exist and this is the charge. So beyond that, Henry, I can't answer your question. He certainly sort of had a horse in the race in that there was something to find here, but whether or not he's you know, kind of was committed to an actual value, I don't know that that's the case.
We do have some questions from a little bit earlier in the chat that maybe now is the time to ask them.
That's great.
So would an analysis of supposed contaminated data points be something to put in supplementary data, or should it be in the main text? And then kind of a related question, how would you present or publish contaminated data?
Yeah, so let's hold on to those thoughts for just a second, Shiver, because one of the last questions I want to ask for this case is essentially like, what could he have done or what should he have done? And I think what the students are picking up on is there's other ways that he might have gone about doing this that didn't involve just kind of like not saying anything at all. Yeah, so let's now kind of do our time machine, right? What would happen if the Horton's revelation didn't come out decades after Millikan was dead, but was actually perhaps, you know, lodged by the person who he was in a dispute with about whether or not electrons existed at all, right? If that person sort of move it to the present, that person contacts somebody at the University of Chicago and says, hey, I've heard that actually Millikan, what he's saying in that paper is not an accurate statement about what he collected over this period of time, right? The question would be, would that lead to a decision that Millikan engaged in research misconduct? And so to answer that question, we need to know what research misconduct is. It has a very specific definition from the Office of Research Integrity, and it means the fabrication, the falsification, or the plagiarism in proposing, performing, or reviewing research or in reporting research results. This is sometimes referenced as the FFP definition of research misconduct, the fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. So fabrication, right? It's your making up data or results, sort of whole cloth. Falsification is you're manipulating the materials, the equipment, the processes, you're changing, you're omitting data in such a way that you are not in the end accurately representing what you've done. Or plagiarism, right? This is something that you should all be familiar with, you know, since middle school, right? Or even elementary, right? It's you're taking somebody else's ideas and not giving them credit. So let's start here. If that person in Austria wanted to accuse Millikan of research misconduct, which of these things would he be accusing him of?
Falsification?
Exactly, falsification, right? Definitely not plagiarism. There's no thought that Millikan was ripping somebody else off. They don't think that he just made it all up. The key would be, right, that did he omit data or results such that the research record was reported inaccurately. So how would he fare? Of all the cases we're going to talk about today, this continues to be, I would say, one of the most contentious cases from the history of science when it comes to research misconduct. I have talked to research ethics experts who will say this is a classic, obvious case of research misconduct, of falsification. He said in the paper, this is not a selected data set. You go to his research record, it's a selected data set. There's nothing else to say here. I've also encountered some of the best researchers that we have at the University of Utah who have come and given guest lectures in my research ethics classes who say, no, it's not that straightforward. When Millikan says in the paper, this is not a selected data set, what he's conveying is this is not a selected data set as long as the machine was working properly. And when we add to that, that when this revelation came about, Millikan wasn't alive anymore. There was no way to ask him questions. All we've got are these, jottings, that summary sort of statements about what's going on in these experiments. We should give him the benefit of the doubt and say he was still working some things out, right? So, I mean, this is one of these cases. A lot of these cases in research ethics, they do become pretty clearly like this was just a miscommunication, or it was unintentional, or no, that look, this was clearly intentional. This is the case we don't have a lot to go on. In fact, the National Science Foundation has convened panels to look at this case and to see if they could sort of reach a definitive conclusion about whether or not Millikan engaged in research misconduct. And even the panel couldn't agree on that, which I think is kind of really interesting. So, but let's ask the kind of final question, which starts to get to some of the points that Shiver picked up in the chat. Let's imagine we have a time machine. We can go back in time to Millikan, not bring him to the present, but go to the past and say, hey man, you get the Nobel Prize, but like, you're going to be a case study in research ethics classes for years to come, because there's this this debate about whether or not you were being honest. What could Millikan have done back then? Or if somebody encounters a similar situation now, what could somebody do now to avoid this kind of ambiguity in terms of judging whether or not somebody is being genuinely transparent? What could Millikan have done to navigate this? Go ahead and just jump in.
So like, if we go back to those 4 options, like I think either options 2 or 3, where you either like do the statistics with it and publish that, or just at least publish the results so that it's clear that you did it, and then you say that this doesn't count because this. And then that way, if people did have an issue, they could always just use those results in the final calculations as well.
Yeah, thanks, Arthur. Yeah, so erring on the side of transparency, right? Being a little more transparent about what you found. If in fact, right, you really did hit on the right thing, time will tell. And to go back to, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on who brought this point up earlier. You've disappeared into the masses of Zoom faces, but about, if you want somebody to be able to replicate this and do it themselves, you want to be able to give them the heads up of this is the kind of thing that you need to think about and deal with when you're trying to do the oil drop experiment, right? Another way to do this would have been to sort of have divide the research process up into 2 steps. The first step, you're just testing the machine to figure out how it works and when it works and when it doesn't work, and what the variables are that you take into consideration that would determine whether it's working or not working. But you're not collecting and sort of counting any of that data. Then once you've decided on that, you move into the data collection phase and you deploy the lessons that you developed in the first stage. And so typically the way this would, you might have heard of things like inclusion or exclusion criteria. Researchers will talk about inclusion and exclusion criteria. And what they're saying is, right, in this case, it would be something like, if it's a double drop, it gets excluded, right? If the temperature goes outside this range, it gets excluded. Right, if the voltage is not behaving in some way, it gets excluded. But the assumption would be, right, with a machine like this, once you've determined what those exclusion criteria are, and then you go into the data collection phase, when you're running it, if one of those exclusion criteria are not met, then you're going to include it, right? And obviously, this isn't the answer I was expecting to get, would not be a legitimate exclusion criteria, right? Error high is not going to, too high by 1.5% is not going to be an exclusion criteria. You're going to need something more specific than that to talk about how the machine is behaving, right? And so that's a way that he could have done it. Another thing, that's becoming more and more common is there's methods journals, right? We've got something like Nature Methods, where what you're initially doing is just publishing the thing that works this way, that does this. And then you draw on that to have another publication that talks about how it works. And so, this isn't something that Millikan would have kind of thought of back in his day, 100+ years ago, but that is something that can happen now, where you're sort of telling the scientific community first, hey, I've got this thing that's testing reality in this way, and this is how it works, and this is how you know when it is or is not working. And then you can subsequently point to that when you're collecting data and talking about what you found. So let's go to a second case now. This one, again, it'll be a sort of a question mark. Is it or is it not research misconduct? And now we're dealing more with publication, authorship, collaborative science. Okay, so here is our scenario. Sorry if I keep moving these bars around. A junior scholar in the field sends you a manuscript to review for feedback, and in it is a novel theory of species change. In fact, it's the same theory that you've spent years developing in private with an eye towards publishing in book form. So you've been working on this project for a number of years, but you haven't actually published it yet. Some younger person comes along and says, hey, will you take a look at what I've got? And when you see what they've got, you realize what they've got is what you've got. You've been scooped. So what are you going to do about this now? Okay. Do you just ignore the manuscript, right? Proceed as if it never happened? Do you arrange for some sort of joint presentation where both independent discoveries can be announced? Do you turn this new bit of information, this new manuscript, over to somebody independent and ask them to handle it, right? Or do you tell the junior person, hey, shove off, I'm on it, I'll take it from here, don't bother wasting your time? So again, go ahead and just jump into chat and then tell us whether you're a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 4. Shiver, are we seeing any trends?
We got a lot of 2s again and
Okay.
some 3s.
Good. That makes sense. Anybody know who this is?
Darwin and Wallace?
Yes, exactly. It is Darwin. He is the senior individual, and it is Wallace. That's the junior person. Okay. So that's Charles Darwin on the right. Some of you may know from your history of science. So his famous voyage of the Beagle, where he's collecting lots of the samples and information that then goes on to become the foundation in part of what we now recognize as evolution by natural selection. He's on the Beagle in the 1830s. Origin of Species doesn't come out until 1859. So there's like a 25, 30-year gap there. It's clear from his research notebooks that he was on to evolution by natural selection by the 1840s. There's still 10 to 15 years between him hitting on this idea and then actually publishing the book, okay? During that time, Darwin was trying to collect, he knew he was onto a controversial idea, and he was trying to collect as much data as possible to make the case for it. So he's looking for evidence of evolution by natural selection in orchids and earthworms and pigeons, barnacles, basically trying to show you, wherever you look in nature, you're going to find evolution by natural selection. It's not clear whether he ever would have published it had it not been this manuscript that comes from this guy, Alfred Russel Wallace. In the 1850s, he's essentially doing what Darwin had done 20+ years ago. He's also on his own voyage, collecting samples and sending them back to Britain to be housed in the British Museum. And the story goes, in a malarial fever, I think he was in Malaysia at the time, he hits on evolution by natural selection. And even though Darwin hadn't written up The Origin of Species yet, he was known in the scientific world to be working on what at the time they were calling the transmutation of species. And so it was natural for Wallace to sort of jot this idea down and then send it to Darwin. When Darwin gets it, he sees, my God, the kid's got me. He's hit on the same idea. So for those of you that picked 3, hand the case over to somebody else and let them deal with it. You were right in that that's exactly what Darwin did. He turned it over to Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell is considered the sort of godfather of geology. He moved geology from what was at the time sort of thought of as an amateurish hobby to a science. And Lyell was by far the most sort of famous living name in science at that time, or maybe not one of the most famous living scientists in Britain at that time. And he knew what Darwin was working on. They were Lyell was a mentor to Darwin. So Darwin basically tells Lyell, here's the situation. Wallace hit on it. You know what I've been doing. I'll let you handle this. If you pick 2, then you also got it right, because that's exactly what Lyell did. Lyell arranged for a joint presentation where Wallace's manuscript would be presented at the Linnaean Society alongside some of Darwin's material. And then they would both sort of get acknowledged for having hit on this independently. To this day, there is something called the Darwin-Wallace Medal that is honored. It's kind of like the Nobel Prize in evolutionary biology, and it remembers this particular day when there was this joint presentation. Interesting, neither Darwin or Wallace were at the presentation. Wallace is in Malaysia, doesn't even know it's happening, right? There's nobody could phone him up or send him an email and say like, hey man, you're famous. Darwin, sadly, one of his children was dying, and so was wrapped up in grief and everything that would go along with that horrific experience. And so he couldn't attend either. So when evolution by natural selection was released to the world with 2 names attached, Darwin and Wallace, neither of those men were actually there. Okay, let's do this one. This is another kind of authorship one. Your lab has been struggling with efforts to determine the structure of a molecule. When you visit another lab where the molecule is being researched, one of the senior people there shows you imaging work done by one of the junior people there. And that image is what you need, but actually couldn't get yourself to complete your model, right? So you're working on trying to figure out what's the structure of this thing. You are limited in your ability to access information about it. But you go to another lab where you know they're doing it, and you are given access to this thing that you couldn't get yourself. And now that you've got that, you are able to complete your model. But the person who created that thing didn't give it to you. The person who created that thing's supervisor gave it to you. Right? So how are you going to navigate this? Do you just use the other lab's image for your model and publish by yourself? Now that you know the answer, do you try to recreate it? And then once you've recreated it, go by yourself? You try just to invite the junior person over there who created the data point to join you? Or do you try to sort of just bring everybody together and let it be kind of one giant publication that everybody participates in? Go ahead, 1, 2, 3, or 4. How are we looking, Shiver?
3s and 4s.
Okay, good. Does anybody know what actually happened?
They took it.
Number 1, that's right, Nathan. So who is our junior imaging specialist?
Rosalind.
Franklin.
Rosalind Franklin. Good. Look at that. I'm so thrilled that you all know that name. This is a tougher one. Who's the senior person who gave Rosalind Franklin's image to the others?
Is it Watson, Crick?
Close, Gladwin. Watson and Crick are the people who got the image. So, and in this case, in fact, it's Watson, it's not Crick. But you got the other players here. So there's only one more person in this mix, and it's the guy who gave Rosalind Franklin's image to James Watson. Anybody know? There we go. So here are our players, right? James Watson, Francis Crick, Rosalind Franklin, Maurice Wilkins. Okay, so Watson and Crick at the time are working at Cambridge, trying to figure the structure of deoxyribonucleic acid. And they know at University College London, just a couple train stops away in London, Maurice Wilkins and Rosalind Franklin are working on the same thing. Okay. Watson was a geneticist by training, a fly geneticist, so he knows the ins and outs of genetics. Crick was a theoretical physicist, and so He brought the kind of basics of physics to this relationship. Neither of them were good at X-ray crystallography. And X-ray crystallography at the time was the method for trying to gather information that let you make inferences about the structure of molecules. Rosalind Franklin was among the best X-ray crystallographers in the world at the time, and she's working with Maurice Wilkins at University College London. And so Watson and Crick are trying to figure out what the structure of DNA is, but they can't figure it out because they just don't have all the pieces of the puzzle. The story goes, Watson is visiting University College London to talk about what they're doing. And Maurice Wilkins says, well, Rosie's been working on this, and shows this exact image to James Watson. And this is Rosalind Franklin's X-ray crystallographic image of deoxyribonucleic acid. And basically, based on that X pattern, the orientation of those lines, how far apart they are, you are able to make inferences about the structure of a molecule. And so Watson sees that and says, that's very interesting. Thanks for sharing. Walks out, jots it down, takes the train back to Cambridge, sits down with Crick, and that's the last piece of the puzzle that they need to then give us what we now recognize as the double helical structure of DNA. Right? So when they've got that, the question becomes, who should be on the paper that's going to announce this? Because everybody knows this is going to be big news. It was the grand prize that labs in Britain, Europe, the United States were all racing towards in the early 1950s. As you can see by that list of papers there, essentially the two teams published separately. We get the Watson and Crick 1953A, Watson and Crick 1953B. That's where they first introduced the structure and then talk about the sort of implications for how we think about heredity. Wilkins publishes, Franklin publishes, Franklin publishes, and essentially they're doing it distinct from one another. When it comes time for the Nobel Prize goes to Crick, Watson, Maurice Wilkins. Rosalind Franklin was not eligible for the Nobel Prize because she died before it was awarded. They do not award the Nobel Prize posthumously. And so because she was dead, they did not have to make a decision about who to add. If she were still alive, it would have made this an interesting scenario for how to deal with. So I think I'm not going to put up this first question. Well, yeah, I'll phrase it this way. So were Watson and Crick guilty of research misconduct? Obviously, we're not talking fabrication or falsification here. The question would be, did they plagiarize her? One last wrinkle in all this is, in that first paper, they include an acknowledgement where they thank Rosalind Franklin for her imaging work. So is that count as legitimate acknowledgement, right? How would they have fared today? This would clearly fall into a category of what is commonly thought of as an authorship dispute. It would not get handled like research misconduct, almost certainly not. It would get handled as an authorship dispute. And we're going to talk about, there's a little bit more just in the next case. And so I'm going to hold on to that for now, because one of the lessons I want you all to have for today is how to avoid finding yourself in an authorship dispute. So what should they have done is, I'm picking up the pace a little bit here because I want to make sure we get through this before we run out of time. They should have asked Rosalind Franklin to be a part of their team. It worked a little bit differently back then. So when publication decisions were made, oftentimes even the authors didn't get much say in that. Watson and Crick went back, reported to their higher ups what they had. Their higher up talked with Wilkins and Franklin's higher up, and they sort of sorted out how they were going to proceed with the publications. So this is partly to say this wasn't a decision that was just made by Watson and Crick. But no matter who you place the decision on, it was certainly an outcome that did wrong by Rosalind Franklin. She was taking advantage of this in the scenario. She is the fact that many of you recognize her name, I think, is fantastic. But you move outside the domain of academic young aspiring scientists, the number of people that know the name Rosalind Franklin is much lower than the number of people that know Watson and Crick, and that's in part because of how this shook out, and that's unfortunate. So let's go to this last case, and then I'll try to wrap it up for you. Okay, so you're a grad student or you're an undergrad, it doesn't really matter. You worked for over 2 years with your mentor on developing a new methodology for measuring properties in particle physics. You and your mentor have just completed the first manuscript announcing what you know is going to be really groundbreaking results. But you've also got 4 more manuscripts in the works. So you're getting ready to send off the first manuscript. And your mentor approaches you and reminds you that you need a sole authored publication for your PhD. Or if you're an undergrad, you could say, you need a sole authored publication for your undergrad thesis, or for me to write your letter of recommendation. Or the gist of it is you need one by yourself. So his proposal is he's going to take sole authorship of the first one. You'll take sole authorship of the last one. And then the three in between you'll be co-authors on, okay? And you realize this is essentially bullying you out of the first paper, which is going to be the one that's the real prize, right? Okay, so what do you do? Accept the mentor's proposal. What can you do? Try to convince him, talk to sort of the department program head, their boss, right? Or you could talk to somebody called a research integrity officer. Every university has a research integrity officer now, and that's the person where someone who has a complaint about fabrication, falsification, plagiarism, may worry about an authorship issue, would take that complaint.
We're mostly seeing 4s, but some 2s and 3s also.
Okay. So let me explain you what this is. This is the case of Harvey Fletcher. The reason I like talking about this case, in part, I mean, it's a research ethics case, but also he's a local Utah guy. And so it hit close to home. He was born in Provo, son of Mormon pioneers. He went to BYU. Even if you go to the University of Utah, I think you should be able to appreciate that. He invented the hearing aid, right? And then after he did this work, graduate work and then professional work, he actually comes back and works at BYU as a professor. But in between BYU undergrad and then BYU professor, he did his PhD at the University of Chicago, working under the person that you all now are familiar with, Robert Millikan. And it was when Fletcher got to the University of Chicago, it wasn't called the oil drop experiment, it was called the water drop experiment. And it was it was Fletcher's idea to try doing it with a mist of oil instead of a mist of water. So he really contributed in part to how to think about how this thing operated. He collected a lot of the data when the crucial sort of work was being done and it was being worked out. And Fletcher gave this interview that he only agreed to allow being published after he was dead. And so basically he knew there were rumors circulating about whether or not Millikan did wrong by him. And this was his version of the story. He says, answering a knock, I went to the door, was surprised to see it was Millikan. Why would he come to our apartment? I soon found it was decided who was to be the author on that paper referred above. That's the first paper. There are 4 other in the works, right? He says, if I use the paper to publish for my doctor's thesis, I have to be sole author. It was obvious that he wanted to be sole author on the first paper. I didn't like this, but I couldn't see other way around it. So I agreed to use the 5th paper as my thesis. So, what he's saying there is, yeah, Millikan sort of bullied me out of it. But then he goes on. People have frequently asked me if I have bad feelings towards him. He not letting me be joint author on the paper that got him the Nobel Prize. My answer has always been no. It's obvious that I was disappointed, done considerable work, expected to be a co-author, but he was good to me. It was through his influence that he got to the University of Chicago. He found him remunerative jobs. Above this was the friendship, and it was a mentorship relationship that lasted a lifetime. And so you get, pretty stand-up guy, right? He clearly was taken advantage of by Millikan, and yet he sees the complex nature of this relationship between him and his mentor. What would have happened if something like this played out now? So this would be another example of an authorship dispute. If Fletcher had gone to the research integrity officer, so at the University of Utah, our research integrity officer is Aaron Rothwell. That's the person who oversees all allegations of research misconduct. If there's anything that sort of revolves in the domain of what we've been talking about today, research integrity, responsible conduct of research, it's going to go to her office, and she'll help that person navigate how to deal with it. Authorship disputes are the most common complaint that research integrity officers get. And they're actually among the least that they can do anything about, because unlike fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, there are very straightforward mechanisms for how to deal with those. Authorship disputes are a little murkier. To Aaron Rothwell, our research integrity officer's credit, she is in the process of trying to help the university develop standards for publication and authorship so that these issues are easier to deal with when they do arise. But in many cases, once an authorship dispute has happened, there's not a lot of wiggle room. You've already got sides that are pretty well entrenched in their position. Oftentimes the junior person in the relationship has the least leverage, and they're the ones who get burnt on it. So let me just sort of leave you with this thought on the last case. What can students do to prevent such situations from arising? You're going to be embarking on research opportunities. You're going to be working with faculty, with PIs on projects. I encourage you, and you can tell them, hey, Tabery told me to ask you this, to have conversations with your mentors early about how authorship works in their community, in their lab. If you are moving into a role that somebody else played, does that, and you're going to be with them for a year, is that sufficient to be an author? If you have been working with somebody and now you're leaving, are they going to stay in communication with you so that if an opportunity comes to publish something from that work, you'll be invited to contribute to it, right? The more you can have that open communication about authorship works, the less likely it is that you're going to get a surprise and a negative surprise where you thought something was going to go one way and it turns out it goes in another way. And again, because you are all students now, you've got less leverage. And so it's way better to try to kind of anticipate this stuff and prevent it from happening than trying to retrospectively fix it, right? And I assume you're all going to go on and be fantastic research scientists and PIs yourself. And when you are, I hope you will install a sort of plan of having open communication with your students about this so that these kind of problems don't arise. So here we'll sum up in the last 30 seconds. Okay. So as a discipline, the responsible conduct of research as a regulatory system, it's pretty new. It's only in the last 50 years ago that we've started talking about things like institutional review boards, conflicts of interest committees, institutional animal care and use committees, the sort of actual bodies and regulations that oversee research ethics. But I hope you've seen now, right, that opportunities for responsible and irresponsible conduct of research are as old as science, right? As long as people have been collecting data, they've had to navigate questions about data management. As long as people have been working with others on a project, they've had to think about, hey, who's going to be responsible and who gets the benefits of this, right? At their best, I think, you know, and this is the reason I think the Darwin case is nice to point to. In some cases, we see, you know, from the history of science, scientists that go above and beyond. I think Darwin handled this about as well as you could imagine anybody handling it back then. At their worst, right, we get these examples that mar an entire discipline, mar a discovery. Molecular biology as a field is still known to have this misogynistic history built into it. And there are complaints that elements of it are still there. And the Watson and Crick episode and what happened to Rosalind Franklin is one of these exhibits that people point to. And so to show, look how this woman was mistreated. That's not okay. And then I do think, you know, there's some cases that are less clear cut. I'm not talking about Millikan's treatment of Fletcher. I think it is clear that Millikan mistreated Fletcher, but that debate about, you know, sort of was he honest or dishonest? Did he lie in that paper? This is one that people continue to debate. But the last thought is, if you ever find yourself in a research ethics conundrum, you just ask yourself, what would Darwin do? If we were all in person, I actually have bumper stickers that say this, and I would hand them out to people that guessed the various scientists over the years, but it's COVID times. Hopefully it's soon enough we'll be doing this in person again. Keep your eyes out. Every now and then I see a car driving around campus with a "What would Darwin do" sticker on its bumper. Now you know where it came from.